the United Nations troops push on in the cautious advance against the communists. An advance whose purpose, General Ridgway states, is not to seize ground, but to wipe out the enemy. The Chinese Red Army, fighting desperately in small isolated stands, prefers to give ground on wider fronts rather than join battle. And it's up to the infantry to clear out the pockets of die-hard communists. With the enemy falling back to the Han River, United Nations commanders had expected that the Reds would make their stand there. But under a steady, withering barrage, GIs are
able... Every war leaves its mark. Every period of history deserves mention of some armed conflict or other. Yet visit a library near you and look up the words "Forgotten War" in the online catalog. It is astounding to see how many conflicts throughout history have been described as such. Books with the term "Forgotten War" included in the title have been written about all sorts of wars, from international conflicts and humanitarian crises to some of the key military events in early American history. Even World War I, unquestionably one of the most gruesome and consequential wars in history, and one whose memory is certainly kept alive through various museums and monuments all throughout Europe, may not be faring so well on this side of the Atlantic.
The Americans have not remembered World War I. I wish they did. I talk about it a lot with my students because I think there are very, very important lessons to be drawn.
Had World War I been the end, had it been the war to end all wars, as it was called at the time, maybe we'd reflect differently now, but in a sense, World War I just became the prelude to World War II. And in that sense, World War II swallowed World War I, maybe in the collective memory, in part because some of the same soldiers and some of the same nations fought on some of the same battlefields. And so I think that goes away toward explaining maybe the less attention that World War I gets nowadays.
Sadly, what would have been the war to end all wars in a more just world has largely failed to capture the American imagination. Take a look at the way in which the First World War is memorialized on the National Mall compared to its sequel. It should be perfectly obvious which of the two conflicts Americans are more interested in remembering. There are many valid reasons why the Second World War continues to absorb so much of our attention, even when at the expense of other important conflicts. No other war in history was so widespread and destructive, nor did any manage to produce such a universally recognized dramatis persona. The controversies surrounding other wars in modern military history are largely absent from World War II. It had a clear, iconic hero and a clear, iconic villain. The United States only entered it after having been attacked by the enemy, not the other way around. And it had a happy ending defined by a series of parades following a total Allied victory in 1945. Hence, its status as the good fight has endured. World War II enforces the idea of America as a global savior, coming in to fight the bad guys and save the day, while helping less powerful nations to achieve peace and stability. That makes it a war which the United States remains eager to celebrate and promote.
World War II we called the Good War, and the people who fought it we referred to as the greatest generation. And that's a war that actually fits our narrative about American exceptionalism. But after that, we're in trouble.
Hopes for a bit of peace, following years of bloodshed across the globe, were dashed when thousands of troops were rushed out to a faraway land known as Korea after the North invaded the South on June 25, 1950. The map of Korea at the time made it clear that the region had become a microcosm of the Cold War landscape. America had to prove it had the upper hand in this emerging conflict. while the United Nations, largely an American-backed initiative, had to demonstrate its value as a peacekeeping force, which its predecessor, the League of Nations, had failed to do. Hence, a great number of United Nations forces, about 90% of which were American, engaged in what became a 2.5-year operation. Fierce combat occurred as the two sides pummeled each other back and forth across the peninsula. All of those who survived the fighting would forever be shaken by what they had seen and experienced there.
And giving close and welcome support to the surface forces in the attack are the ever-present Air Force.
During the time that I was in Korea, I experienced a number of difficult circumstances, including engaging in the Battle of Pork Chop Hill, where we lost a lot of people, as we did on Jane Russell Hill. I think a lot about the people that we lost during the war, and probably not a day that goes by that I don't think about some of my buddies that I left there.
The nightmare would endure for the American troops, particularly once the Chinese Red Army made an unexpected entrance into North Korea and joined the fight. While the bombing campaign against Japan in World War II had been hellish, in this war, the United States bombed Korea 4 times as badly, flattening most major cities in both the North and the South. To no avail, however. After realizing that the fight was going nowhere, both sides agreed to a ceasefire on July 27, 1953. Only a ceasefire, though, not a full-out peace treaty, meaning that the two countries technically remained at war and that the U.S. would not dictate terms of surrender as it had grown accustomed to doing. The nature of this denouement, as well as how the conflict had played out for the Americans, made the kissing and euphoria of VE Day seem a million miles away.
The Korean War is an ugly, drawn-out affair, fought in a place where American policymakers said we didn't have any interest, where the American military thought we didn't have any real interest, and it was a bloodbath. For the United States to actually have a stalemate with a peasant army, despite our atomic bombs and our overwhelming power, that was a real setback for the United States and its pretensions about being the most powerful force on the earth. And so the Korean War we forget because it's not a war that we're proud of.
It always takes time to properly evaluate the impact and legacy of wars. But after a generation had passed, the scholarship was in, and the verdict was unkind. The Korean War had become America's forgotten war. In sharp contrast to World War II, this was a war without any iconic hero or villain, in which the United States had not been attacked first, and which had ended with a tense and messy armistice in lieu of any victory parade. The images this war had produced were not of American soldiers rushing onto the Normandy beaches and wiping out the Nazis, but rushing away from scattered, ill-equipped Chinese soldiers and perishing in the cold of Korea. For these reasons, America seemed as keen to forget the Korean War as it was to remember and celebrate the Second World War. Granted, many of those unfavorable qualities also applied to the Vietnam War, a conflict which bears a lot of alarming parallels to the Korean War. In fact, Vietnam was in many ways a more devastating and total loss than Korea had been. Yet because Vietnam dwarfed Korea in scale and duration, and also produced far greater nationwide backlash and domestic repercussions, Vietnam became a generation-defining conflict for the United States in a way that Korea never did. A primary reason why the latter is considered forgotten in America is because it was sandwiched between two other wars that developed into all-conquering cultural obsessions. At first glance, this 2.5-year conflict may appear to be of secondary importance in the grand scheme of the Cold War and the 20th century's military timeline.
Vietnam had this impact that was beyond foreign policy, that was beyond geopolitics. It seemed to redefine American society, U.S. society. Korea was just something that had happened beforehand, seemed to, at least in my imagination growing up, have a localized impacted and left a divided Korea, and that was really about it.
It is easy to think of the many ways in which the Korean War's cultural impact is limited. Try thinking of famous images from World War II and the Vietnam War. It's something of a no-brainer, isn't it? Try doing the same with the Korean War, and you're likely to come up empty. Nothing to be ashamed about there. The Korean War simply failed to produce any signature, iconic imagery. Even this Pulitzer Prize-winning photograph from 1951 by Max Desfer is far from world famous. As for movies about the conflict, well, at least there'll always be MASH. But compared to the unbelievable wealth of films, not to mention novels and plays that have come from its 20th century counterparts, it is easy to recognize the extent to which the Korean War lags in terms of cultural focus. However, we are doing our obsession with World War II and the Vietnam War a disservice by failing to remember the Korean War, given its status as a key product of one of these wars and a key catalyst of the other. To do justice to our undying fascination with World War II, we must fully appreciate its global impact. Humankind's fiercest ever combat left 70 million dead and 2 superpowers standing, both of whom came to first mistrust and then despise one another. The Korean War is among the first and one of the most devastating consequences of this ideological rivalry forged by the Second World War. Moreover, after having drastically cut its defense budget after 1945, the United States multiplied it nearly 4 times over to close to $50 billion by 1953. While war-weary America had been on the path of disarmament and isolationism after the Second World War, the Korean War single-handedly sent the country in a different direction: heightened military strength, wariness of global communism, and commitment to defending faraway regions, particularly in East Asia, from insurgent attacks. When we allow the memory of the Korean War to slip away through our fingers, we allow all these important clues about the origins of the Vietnam War to slip away as well.
Korea it's directly relevant to understanding the Vietnam War. Wholly apart from the idea of fighting communism and the domino theory, etc. How we fought the Vietnam War was guided in large measure by what we thought we did right and wrong in Korea. We went in Korea from a defense of the South to an invasion of the North. And in Vietnam, no one seriously considered taking the United States military troops across the dividing line into North Vietnam because of the lessons of Korea. When that happened, the Chinese intervened. We're not going to make that same mistake again. There was talk in the Korean War of possibly using our nuclear arsenal against the Chinese. By the time we get to Vietnam, there's no serious talk of using our nuclear arsenal. There's no serious talk of bombing some Chinese and Soviet cities for their support of the North Vietnamese. So we have learned, in a way, from Korea, in very important ways that affects our overall strategy in Vietnam,